I remember a story here, a very interesting story that I heard on American radio, American Forces Radio in Japan in the late 70s, about a big rock that was a program on unexplained phenomena, Fortean phenomena. One night, a big rock, huge boulder appeared out of nowhere in the middle of the city square of an American city on the East Coast. Next morning, all the city elders gathered. The rock was so big they couldn't haul it in any truck. They had to cut it in pieces or to dynamite it. Scientists were called in, and one of them said, well, maybe this is a materialization of some material out of a different dimension. And I said, nah, different dimension, my left foot. That was almost 20 years ago, when I have absolutely no idea about time travel, about different parallel dimensions and so on. Yeah, the 14 phenomena were absolute taboo in Eastern Europe, and still are widely unknown. But the program ended with the words, and the name of this scientist was Albert Einstein, and I clearly remember to this day cold ants crawling down my back, because I realized that there may be something more serious to this rather than just a simple joke. Then I remember another story in a science fiction magazine. My personal feeling is that many of the science fiction stories that we read, and even many of the tabloid reports that we read, and that the supermarket checkout lines are daily. I'm subscribed to most of the tabloid papers, and the Weekly World News is my favorite one. My feeling is that this is a very subtle way of manipulation and of education of the whole society. It works on a principle similar to the immunization of an organism with a weakened poison or a weakened disease, so that the organism can develop its antibodies. In this case, the lowest strata of society that doesn't read anything else but tabloid papers serve as this sacrificial lamb that is exposed to the dangerous, threatening information, and through many years of such bombardment, they finally learn to live with UFOs visiting us every day, or the government manipulating space, manipulating time, manipulating the genetic code, creating hybrids between humans and animals, between humans and aliens. And in many ways, the science fiction literature has been serving the same purpose. There are so many stories that are written after a carefully orchestrated or designer leak, as I call them sometimes, happens, and some intelligence official contacts his friend, who happens to be a writer, and a nice best-selling story or short story or novel appears on the book, on the market after some time. So in this science fiction story, two British constables discovered one night a talking head that was appearing, protruding out of the pavement and smiling and talking to them. And little by little, more and more human parts and whole and half bodies and whole bodies appeared out of the pavement, out of bricks, out of walls, out of ceilings, out of everywhere. So this is a very interesting attempt to acquaint the public with the possibility that it is possible to walk through walls, that it is not that difficult and dangerous. And obviously these are signs that secret programs have been going on behind the scenes. For me, every story that I read in the tabloid papers is an indication that some research of that type is going on somewhere behind the scenes, and somebody is interested in educating the whole society, so that 20 or 50 years later, when this research would be put out in the open, in public, in the academia, there wouldn't be a massive panic or suicides. What other byproducts, I mean negative byproducts of the Philadelphia experiment would you comment upon? Or maybe some of these first nuclear tests that we were talking today that had some very interesting starry effects?
Well, we can go into the nuclear test program, but first I would point out the phenomena which has been discussed and described is certainly not new to this century. Charles Fort, who was an ordinary newspaper reporter a century and a half ago in England, would start investigating some of these strange occurrences and reports he heard, and of course, like most other people at the time, was very skeptical, but started clipping these newspaper files, and he wound up with some 50 or 100 shoeboxes full of clippings, which wound up being eventually the property of the Fortean Society. He wrote a series of books, Land of the Damned and a few others, in which he concluded that basically we might be the property of somebody else. But he documented so many of these strange occurrences, like frogs falling out of the heaven, fish falling out of the heavens on the ground, and other strange falls, even parts of bathrooms, of sinks and what have you, angel hair, animals, just coming out of nowhere. There has to be an explanation, but none could be found at that time, and the scientists, of course, ignored it. These things have been going on through quite a period of time, and they're not new to us. But this sort of thing continues, and we have these barroom brawls, which may have been induced by hardware that we controlled. Who knows what caused these other phenomena 100 years ago? When we came on to the era of the nuclear energy, where we dropped the bombs in Japan, we had atomic tests in the Pacific in 1946 and 47, which were essentially ordinary atomic bombs. I use that term ordinary advisedly because it kept growing in size and power, but in 1952, with Edward Teller having created it, they were ready to test the first hydrogen bomb. And in 1954, they tested a second one. And what I remember, if my dates are correct, was the second test they had an enormous problem with. They decided they wanted a 3-mile-long tunnel to instrument the rate of propagation of the explosion. And it was very carefully instrumented with very precise equipment, because EG&G instruments all of these tests, has from the year one and still is to this day. No one else will or can, because they control all the patents. But in any case, all of this very nice equipment was built, and measurement equipment and time zero markers and so forth, and high-speed cameras. So they detonated the device, and as the photos from Life magazine showed, and some of the movie films they showed, a mushroom started to form at the island where the device was in a building, and then all of a sudden it was full-blown, full-size, and covered more than the island. The measurements down the tunnels they expected would take about 18 microseconds for propagation if c is the maximum speed of travel of light or anything in this universe, according to Einstein's theory. Well, the bomb went off, and it was t equals 0 everywhere, as there was no propagation rate. It was instantaneous to the end of the 3-mile tunnels while they lasted. And this threw all of the physicists into a tizzy. They literally threw out the physics books and says, well, we're back to square one, we start over. And none of the physics we know works or means anything anymore. And of course, one of the other aspects was life somehow got a hold of the photos. And as the huge, not mushroom cloud, but hemispherical glowing sphere of light with strange patterns in it started to rise and thin, the aerial cameras which are photographing this whole thing caught some very strange phenomena. You could see from the camera and from the pictures which were published by Life that you were looking through the fireball into what was apparently another universe. They were seeing stars. I never forgot that when I saw that in a published issue of Life, and I found out later from channels Life was almost put out of business over that. They were very severely reprimanded for, however, they didn't even know how they got a hold of the photos, but they did, and they published, which I think the public has a right to know, but the military didn't feel the same way about it, particularly the AEC.
Who cares about the public?
Right. Who cares about the public seems to be the attitude.